Hi, and welcome to Mediation Works. I'm Sharon Sutherland, and I'm here with my colleague, Wendy Lakusta, and our colleague, Colleen Cattell, who is our special guest here to talk about estate mediation today. And Colleen, we're going to just launch right in and ask you the question about, what is estate mediation? Can you give us an overview of what that might look like?
Well, estate mediation usually involves families where someone has died and leaves an estate. So they can be disputes about or problems the family is having with asset distribution, with what wills have set out or not set out.
Sure.
But they're mostly about families because it is about the estate of someone who's died.
And can you give some examples or describe what kinds of issues can be mediated?
Yeah, there are lots. Of course, we know that families come in all different shapes and sizes.
Of course.
So some of the more typical estate disputes that I help people with in mediation are wills variation actions, where someone has drafted a will that maybe hasn't provided equally for their children, or has left a child out. That happens. There's a lot of estrangement in families, of course, like every part of our society. There can be conflict, there can be estrangement. So that kind of case is one that's very amenable to mediation. The other very common one is where couples have married again, so they're in a second marriage. So there can be children from the first marriage, maybe children also from a second marriage, but certainly perhaps a surviving spouse who is not the parent of the children, or a common law relationship. And so that also is very amenable to mediation, because it really takes an examination of all the practical things that you can do when someone is living in a matrimonial home with a partner who's died but leaves surviving children. Yeah, those are sort of the two big ones, but really they can be about all sorts of different kinds of estate issues.
Well, and those two, I mean, they both kind of seem to trigger at a certain point in the process. So it sounds like they would happen after somebody has died, and then how do they come to you and mediation? When does that happen?
Yeah, well, hopefully they come soon, because like any kind of disputes that are about relationships, and they are about relationships. It can be about what to do with the family home and people's belongings. I mean, those are hugely important things. They have huge sentimental value. They have huge monetary value, and their estates, of course, can be very complicated in terms of assets and so on. But it is about relationships, and so with any kind of a conflict, it's better to come into the mediation process earlier. So it may be very quickly after someone has passed away. Sometimes it's after there's already litigation that's started, and often it is after litigation has started. That makes it more difficult because, of course, the litigation process, as we know, is so adversarial. It's very formalistic. And it tends, of course, to get in the way of people talking and communicating. And most conflict in estate cases, as in other areas, arises out of people not being able to communicate. Not through any fault of their own, but because it's a difficult situation, it's stressful, don't necessarily have all of the tools. And in that setting, having that neutral facilitator is, hugely beneficial to getting through the conflict. So the longer people haven't been able to speak, the more difficult it is for them to see the other side's perspective. They might actually start seeing things through their lens. We each see conflict through the lens that we bring to it, so we attribute bad intentions and all of that sort of stuff. And we know that conflict, when it's any conflict, but family conflict, is so close to the heart that it's a stressful thing to live with for any length of time. So ideally, people are mediating, very early, coming with a really problem-solving approach before they get into, entrenched, difficult, places to be around, how to solve the problem.
And just, kind of following from what you're saying there, I know that we've talked in the past about even earlier than that. The
Yes.
preventative kinds of
Yes.
mediation that
Right.
might take place and using mediation in a different way altogether. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, no, and that's a really good question, Sharon, because often families are engaged in estate planning in advance of, right? Ideally,
Right.
families do that. Not all of them do, but if they have, and they've obviously done that, if they've created a will, they may have. There's a lot of use of trusts now in terms of people managing assets. There's a lot of gifting that happens during someone's lifetime. They may provide gifts to children or grandchildren or spouses and so on, common law spouses during their lifetime. So those sorts of planning decisions might also benefit from
Right.
having, you know, a mediator at that point help them, and then it would be really a kind of a facilitation around how to have conversations with the people in your life about the kinds of planning tools that you're going to use and what you're thinking. So
Because it's still a difficult conversation, which is
Right.
It sounds like that's what you're really talking about. Is
Yes.
when is it a difficult conversation that people
Yeah.
are struggling with and might need help with?
yeah, and that would benefit from especially having that sort of neutral, the neutral facilitator
Right.
skilled in helping people with those kinds of conversations.
And hopefully the earlier the better, and the more preventative the better.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that those sort of referrals can come from people who are, you know, doing estate planning, because the thing about estates too is it's very multidisciplinary. People will be using estate lawyers, they'll be often using accountants, they might be using tax experts, and
Well, that leads into, maybe you could talk a little bit about what the process looks like. Or typically, I mean, I'm sure
Yeah.
every situation's a bit different,
Yeah.
but typically what would the process look like?
each one is unique, of course, because it all turns on the dynamics of the people and the relationships they've had and the kind of problems that they're struggling with. But that one of the aspects that is really important is the multidisciplinary part, and estate mediations will often draw on the resources of accountants, especially on the tax side, anyone who can help the group in terms of the decisions they're making. It can be realtors, it can be anyone who can help with the problem, because you know, maybe someone's in a home but needs to downsize and move somewhere else to free up part of the estate to pass down to children. I mean, that's sort of one example. Well, you know, how much money will it take to buy an apartment somewhere for that person? You know, how long are we going to live? So actuarial evidence is important. Actuarial help is important when you're mediating. You know, everybody as the age is concerned about being, you know, having enough, right? So in mediations, we actually have to wrestle that to the ground. You know, we want to provide for someone. Well, what's that going to look like? Where are they going to live? What kind of income is going to be required? So all those sort of financial pieces, we can have those people assisting us right in the mediation room, or available by phone, or sometimes we'll meet and break to get some expert advice on, you know, capital gains tax, right? Fairly complicated, and then come back and keep problem solving.
Well, and I guess it just, especially when you're thinking of the preventative and talking about that, but I imagine it could take place at any point.
Yeah.
It strikes me that the other group of professionals that might be involved in some way, whether making referrals or participating, would be perhaps people involved with gerontology. People who might be healthcare workers, maybe people involved with whatever kind of care needs an aging parent might have. And I don't know, do they participate or do they make referrals?
Yes, they do, and they people will often participate in a support capacity. So especially with somebody who's older. So again, the process is very flexible around that, having support people, whether they be, sometimes they're caregivers, sometimes they're emotional support people, and people who can help people make decisions, because it's, you know, it's weighty stuff, and so having that assistance there can make a big difference.
Right.
Yeah, so that can be very flexible.
So overall, it sounds like it's, excuse me, very much closer to family mediation than to other aspects, like other types of commercial type of disputes.
Yes, it is. It's certainly about families, and it's about families who may have decades of history together. 5 siblings, so who are 50, and you multiply those decades and all the perspectives they'll have on what their family looked like over the, we all have different
sure.
perspectives. We experience our upbringings differently, and so it's very rich in that way. And the other aspect of it, though, it can be much more like commercial litigation, is that some people have very complicated estates. They might own a lot of revenue properties and and financial instruments, and so there's a fair amount of that kind of expertise too that people need to wrestle through.
Well, and I was going to say, most people, when they think of family, think of a divorcing couple.
Right.
They don't think of a broad multi-party. And the way you're describing it, we're talking about a lot of people potentially involved in a conversation in a room. If you've got various family members from different generations, you've got blended families, you've got different spouses who might have been at different times, and then support people, potentially some lawyers in the room, potentially, we're starting to think about a very large number of people who might be involved.
They can be big rooms. They can. But the process is so great because it can be so flexible, and you can really tailor it to work through. We really try in estate cases too to work through those process things beforehand. What's it going to look like? Who does need to be there? Meeting with people in advance to find out where the where the hot spots are, the conversations that are going to be difficult for them. So how do we approach those? Because there is estrangement in families and those sorts of things. So how do you come together in that situation and try to engage in a problem-solving conversation? So there's a lot of process work that happens as a mediator for those.
And so somebody's listening to this video and saying, wow, I think my family needs to have this conversation. How do they go about finding a mediator, and how do you get those other people that you might be having a dispute with to come and have a chat?
Right. Yes. Well, fortunately, I think that mediation is much more on the public's radar now. People are familiar. They may know people who've used mediation. But certainly, many of the lawyers in the province who work in this area are recommending mediation. So are people doing that estate planning in advance, or helping people who are executors. Because it's not just about division of estates. There's the role of the executor. Can be kind of accounting issues, lots of those sorts of things too. I think ideally it will come to mind, because it can be such a difficult area to manage without that kind of facilitation, depending on the family.
And they can just approach a mediator if they think about it, or do they have to go through one of these other professionals?
No, they could absolutely just approach a mediator. And sometimes they may have help from especially legal counsel, but the legal counsel doesn't necessarily have to participate in that session. I mean, obviously the legal counsel can be hugely helpful, and often are present in helping their clients through that process. People can also come on their own, and again, we can break to get that legal advice too, right, and come back, or have counsel available to help them.
Well, that's incredibly helpful, Colleen. It's a great description of what kinds of things might possibly be there.
Or probably only touched on some.
I recognize we're cutting you off with very little time to really talk about the complexities of it, but it gives a little taste of what an estate mediation might look like, what estate planning mediation might look like. And so I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today to share your expertise on that.
You're welcome. You can tell.
Thanks,
I think
Colleen.
it's a pretty good process for people with estate problems.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.